Hey, guess what? Summer is almost here. That means no more classes, staying up late, going to the beach, and finally being able to relax. Well, for the most part. Now, I really hope that description of our long-awaited summer break uplifted your spirits, or at least made you feel something slightly positive. Honestly, even I just felt a huge rush of happiness reading that out loud. If that didn't work for you, let's try something else. Now think about this. Have you ever gotten a really good grade on a test that you studied weeks for? Do you remember feeling a rush of satisfaction when you finally got back your score? How about that really happy feeling you get after spending the whole day with your friends? Or what about when you hear a baby's laugh or the smell of your grandma's cookies baking? Although we don't really think about it, that rush of emotions we feel is actually the release of dopamine, a neurotransmitter that is also known as the happy hormone. Dopamine has a crucial role of regulating feelings of reward, motivation, and happiness, of course. It also regulates motor control and cognitive functioning like memory. If you can frequently feel that rush of emotions, it means that your dopamine levels are probably in a normal range. However, not everyone is able to experience this. Low levels of dopamine can be a catalyst to medical conditions like ADHD. ADHD is a neurobehavioral disorder that impacts cognitive and behavioral functioning. It impedes the ability to focus on tasks, plan, time manage, and can cause overwhelming disorganization, stress, and low self-esteem. However, ADHD can be managed through medications like Adderall. My project focuses mainly on the impact of the stimulant Adderall on dopamine levels. Let's go through its characteristics and mechanisms and see how this fascinating drug interacts with our body. Adderall is made up of a mix of amphetamine and dextroamphetamine salts. I'll be focusing mainly on amphetamine. Amphetamine initially works by mimicking the role of dopamine and other neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and serotonin by binding to their individual receptor sites. For dopamine specifically, amphetamine works by increasing extracellular dopamine levels, which is usually regulated by cytoplasmic dopamine flowing out through dopamine transporters. Dopamine transporters are located in the cell bodies of dopaminergic neurons, which are mainly found in the substantia nigra portion of the brain. They start developing during early adolescence and then peak during teenage years. It's made up of 7 alpha helices along with beta sheets. Dopamine is transported from the low concentration synaptic cleft to the relatively high concentration presynaptic neuron, but this takes up a lot of energy because the dopamine molecules are transported against their natural concentration gradient. So, instead of using ATP, the dopamine transporter acts as a secondary active transporter, which allows dopamine to go through it with the help of 1 chloride ion and 2 sodium ions in each molecule. These ions and dopamine move through their concentration gradients together, which makes the reaction energetically favorable. Dopamine transporters are also known as integral membrane proteins. They are transmembrane G proteins embedded within the plasma membrane of neurons, so they bind to molecules on the extracellular side to create new signals on the intracellular side of the membrane. To help you understand this mechanism a bit more, think of dopamine transporters as subway conductors. They pick up the neurotransmitter dopamine from the synaptic cleft and transport them into the cells around them. The dopamine begins its shift of relaying new signals from one nerve cell to the next. However, when someone takes amphetamine-based drugs, like Adderall, the amphetamine binds to the dopamine transporter, causes the dopamine to release through a mechanism called dopamine transporter-mediated reverse transport, and thus inhibits dopamine reuptake. All of that might sound really confusing, so let's rewind a bit and go through the mechanism process together. Amphetamine is known as a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. Here are the chemical structures of dopamine and amphetamine. See any similarities? At first glance, they almost look the same. They both have planar configurations, contain amines and aromatic rings on the aryl side chain. However, dopamine has extra hydroxides, and amphetamine has an added methyl group. Now that you know its characteristics, what kind of inhibitor do you think amphetamine is? Because of the similarities in their structures, amphetamine acts as a competitive inhibitor mimicking dopamine. This lets the dopamine transporter take it into the presynaptic terminal. Amphetamine competes with dopamine to bind to an active site. So, in the terminal, amphetamine removes dopamine from the cytosol and blocks the natural action of the dopamine transporter by binding to it the same central cavity as dopamine. The cytosol is the meeting site for the transporters, so think of it like a bank, where dopamine is stored into vesicles for storage and future use. When amphetamine is introduced into the terminal, the maximum rate of transport, the Vmax, is not affected. But the transporter's affinity for dopamine decreases compared to its affinity for amphetamine. Amphetamine also has affinity for vesicular monoamine transporter 2, or VMAT2. The role of VMAT2 is to transport dopamine into its vesicles. However, amphetamine inhibits this protein so that the displaced dopamine isn't able to relocate back into the intraneuronal storage vesicles. With more amphetamine molecules in the synapse, they will be transported to every molecule of dopamine present. This is the climax point. The system changes and we enter the reverse transport phase. The reuptake transporter's direction reverses. Now, the transporter brings the dopamine out of the neurons and directly into the synapse, instead of making its original trip from the synapse and to the nerve terminal. So, the unabsorbed extracellular dopamine isn't able to re-enter the presynaptic neuron. Now, we have a large amount of extracellular dopamine just hanging around in the synapse. This reverse transport causes accelerated release of dopamine into the synaptic cleft and a lot of dopaminergic neurotransmission. This will cause a buildup of dopamine in the synapse, the central nervous system starts getting impacted, and the effects of amphetamine kick in. It increases attention, focus, organization, and cognitive functions like learning and recall. Now that we know how dopamine and amphetamine interact, let's look at exactly what they interact with. Here is a structure that shows molecular docking of dopamine. Dopamine is shown in red, transporters in gray, and the key central binding site residues from each ligand are in green. The two purple spheres are the sodium atoms, and the green one is the chlorine. Dopamine binds to the dopamine transporter with hydrogen bonds at aspartic acid 121, alanine 117, tyrosine 124, and aspartic acid 46. There are also non-covalent interactions between aromatic rings, also known as pi stacking, with phenylalanine 325. We know that amphetamine structurally mocks dopamine, but in what way? This structure shows molecular docking of amphetamine, which is similar to the one of dopamine. This is done in the dopamine transporter. Amphetamine is shown in red, and everything else is represented the same as the last one we looked at. Although it's hard to see here, there are hydrogen bonds with alanine 117 and valine 120, and direct bonds with the carboxylate side group of aspartic acid 121. Here, the ligand is positioned differently than dopamine, and amphetamine is placed closer to and above phenylalanine 43. Stimulant drugs made of amphetamine, like Adderall, work in our bodies in fascinating ways. No matter what your specialty is in the health field, from psychology to neuroscience, learning about pharmacology of these kinds of drugs not only helps health professionals serve patients better, but also know which decision to make when prescribing medications. Unfortunately, stimulants like Adderall are widely misused, especially by students. Stimulant abuse is an ongoing public health crisis. Not only is this unethical, but it puts the people who actually need it at great risk and disadvantage. Still, there are many natural ways to increase dopamine levels, including a well-balanced diet, enough exercise, and rest. So take this summer to soak up the sun, have fun, and get those dopamine levels up. Thanks for watching.